Hello, and welcome to the webinar Paleography, Deciphering What Our Ancestors Wrote. I'm Allie Golan, Chair of the Education Committee. With this presentation, I will try and shed some light on how to successfully decipher documents from the colonial and revolutionary eras, many of which hold important genealogical and biographical details of our ancestors. I personally became interested in reading colonial handwriting over 10 years ago in the pursuit of documenting my family history. I ran into a challenge when an indexer from a family history library document mistakenly read David Perkins from this document when the name is actually Daniel, but I had submitted a transcribed document to a reviewing genealogist, not the original, and my lineage was rejected. To prove my case, I ordered a copy of the microfilm image and was able to demonstrate that the EL of Daniel had been written so tightly together, those letters resembled a D, and if you look closely only at the N, you can see that it could easily be confused with a V. In the end, my argument was accepted. This is a good example why careful researchers must return to the original documents and not rely on well-intentioned indexers. So let's start with some history on handwriting. Imagine being able to determine someone's occupation, gender, or even their socioeconomic status just by observing their handwriting. So all the doctors write in Garamond, the lawyers can only use Helvetica, middle-aged men get Arial, and the grandmothers have to use Lucinda. That would be crazy, right? But this is exactly how handwriting was taught. Depending on your profession, your gender, possibly even your age, you were meant to use a specific style and font of writing. Thanks to the rigorous teachings of professionals called penmen, merchants wrote strong, loopy logbooks. Women's words were intricate and shaded, and upper-class men did whatever they felt like. The results were so different that a fully literate stranger could evaluate the social significance of a letter simply by how it had been written. Teaching reading and writing were considered very different tasks. Reading was important because it granted access to the most popular book of the day, the Bible. But teaching to write was a secondary skill and was only taught to some. In fact, upper-class colonial men tried to flaunt their status by proving they didn't need to learn such a menial trade and could instead hire a penman. Writing was prevalent really only among the clergy, physicians, and lawyers, with secretaries, clerks, and bookkeepers doing the majority of the writing for everyone else. If a colonist did wish to learn to write, they had to seek private lessons from a writing master. Much of the evolution of handwriting has to do with the instruments available. Let's start with the pen of the colonial era, the quill. These were very simple tools, made from feathers and first introduced in the Middle Ages. Goose feathers were preferred, but also swans, hens, and turkeys. The feathers best used for writing were plucked from live birds. They would heat or soak the feather in hot water and then shape it with a penknife. You were meant to cut the end of the quill with a chisel-shaped edge so that when you wrote, you could vary the width of different parts of a letter depending on what direction the pen was moving, much like calligraphers do today. But you had to be very careful not to break the quill, spill the ink, or apply so much pressure that the ink formed pools on the page or even tore the page. Your handwriting results were determined in large part by how well you cut your quill, how you held the instrument, the position of the paper, and your mastery of the flow of ink. As an aside, you also had to properly prepare your paper with powder, and there were all kinds of variations of ink, but we aren't going to get into those details. At some point, someone figured out that creating a small hole in the nib would allow you to write longer and not have to dip into the ink pot quite as frequently. This not only increased a writer's speed, but is when writers began running letters and words together. The federal census records taken in 1790, 1800, 1810, 1820, and some in 1830, when the steel pen nib was created, were taken with quill pens dipped into an ink pot that traveled with the census taker. The steel nib, invented in 1830, is similar to what we use even today. This increased writing speed because you didn't have to stop and refill the ink so often, but it also limited the amount of shading or artistic input. Let's take a look at penmanship. In the 1600s, penmanship developed in the monasteries, and there were as many styles of handwriting as there were authors. Fast forward to the colonial era, and writing masters were hired to teach handwriting. They taught their students with copybooks. Essentially, these were very much like what we used to use in elementary school, where the printed versions of the letters in their capital and lowercase form ran along the top with lines below to practice. Even with standardized copybooks, though, inconsistent combinations of script, abbreviations, and spelling emerged. Some of these abbreviations include things we still use today, including the ampersand symbol, the symbol for at, and the abbreviation for etc. Okay, let's start with some tips on actual deciphering of records. Before you begin, it's important to know what the general subject matter of the document is about. Different documents will have their own language and purpose as well as context. If you are reading a list of political meeting attendees, or a diary entry, for example, you can expect a less formal font and style than a bill of parcels. Also, contractual documents such as deeds, bail bonds, and wills are more likely to have confusing legal language. So trick number 1, when you first read a document, don't try to read every word. Instead, scan through the sentences and watch for the author's style. Are there abbreviations, as in how this writer wrote the word orders? Does the lowercase d loop over itself, as in the word made? I've seen this trip up many an indexer. Here are some more examples of this style of a D. Notice too on the word remainders how this author writes a lowercase e that resembles our modern day O. This is very common. A lot of confusion results from the way a lowercase e was written, often appearing as an O, as in these examples. These words are privileges, charge, feel, not fool, deep, and one. A lot of people confuse the lowercase s and f, but when you look closely or you take the word in context, you can see the distinctions. In this example, there are 3 instances of a word with 2 s's, and the first is written similarly but not exactly as we would write a lowercase f. It's called a long s, but exprefs, ilnefs, and mifs are not words. So this actually reads, I cannot let the express return without acknowledging your letter of the 30th of September. Notice the abbreviation here with a superscript R for September, wherein you give an account of Mrs. Graves' illness. This line may be here to indicate a pause, since punctuation was not yet standardized. It was very fortunate Miss Hunt was at Bath. The long S isn't just used when a word has 2 S's. Here's an example of the word since. As you read a document through for the first time, take note of the author's personal abbreviation habits. This list of men's names, for example, JNO with a superscript O, is short for John or Jonathan. Robert, James, and William have all been abbreviated as ROB superscript T, JA with a superscript S, and W superscript M. It is very common to see these superscript letters in abbreviated words, and I've seen many indexers not even notice them. If you look closely, you can see there is an A following BENJ, so this would be an abbreviation for Benjamin. At first glance, this word may be Next, you want to check for the author's spelling and its consistency. You will have great variations in spelling from writer to writer, but also even from the same writer. Note in this example, Captain Rosybooms and Captain Rosebooms are from the same writer. When you first read the document, you may only be able to translate a few words, but you can use clues from how those letters are formed and what abbreviations were made to work on other words in a second, third, or fourth pass-through. You have to be persistent, and you may need to read and reread many times before you can, in essence, break the code. Gradually, you will find that more and more words become readable to you, especially if you consider them in the context of what was written. These documents are like scavenger hunts, and you have to be patient to find your reward. The document isn't just going to spill its treasures to you without some effort. Let's take a look at some more examples of letters, and then we'll graduate to full words. Study these examples for a moment. These are in alphabetical order, so they should be easier to decipher. You can see from the letters C and F that some of these vary quite a bit from their modern-day versions. From my days spent reviewing indexers' work, I've seen many confuse this version of an L with an S. And in the colonial era, there was the name Samuel and Lemuel, and many have been mistaken for the other. Here's the rest of that alphabet. Notice on the examples of the capital letter P and the third one, which is not even recognizable compared to today's modern writing. The lowercase examples of the letter Q could easily have been mistaken for a G until that reverse tail was developed. Notice all the variations of a lowercase s, including the lowercase f as we write today. And the lowercase y's could be pretty challenging, but again, in the context of a full word, they might be clearer. Here are some really good examples of the entire alphabet and some words thrown in. Take a look at the D's. A lot of times these were written on top of the line above, making those words hard to read. And here are several variations of the letter T, including without a horizontal cross. This was very common, but in the context of a sentence or even just a word, you could probably make the word out. Okay, let's try our hands at some words and sentences. So, know all men by these presents. We know immediately that this is a legal document. Here's an enlarged version of this document. Study it for a moment before I read it. This document says, "Know all men by these presents that I, George Lewis, in Frederick County, in the colony of Virginia, am holden and firmly bound unto Charles Donahue of the same place in the just and full sum of the 3 pounds Pennsylvania currency." Notice that this author never uses a period. That was really common then. Punctuation just wasn't used the way we rely on it today. You might find sentences just running along one word after another without a comma or period to separate them, as in this example. I have read that sometimes a writer used a dot to indicate where the reader should pause, and while I could not find examples of this, apparently a dot on the line meant a brief pause, while a dot above the word meant a full stop. I was able to find this. A low dot, as we would write a period today, indicated a short breath after a short phrase. A mid dot meant a longer breath after a longer passage, and a high dot marked a full stop at the end of a completed thought. Here are some more tips. Capitalization was not standardized during the colonial era. Often, regular words would be capitalized within a sentence, as in the word example here. It's not unusual at all to see words like these examples capitalized in the middle of a sentence. So don't assume the word is a proper noun or a name just because it starts with a capital letter. By the way, these are the words brought, estate, and divided. I noted earlier that some writers did not cross their T's, leaving them to look like L's. Can you make out this word? I'll give you a clue. This writer dotted his I's far to the right. This is a really difficult one, and of course you have no context. But this word says first, F-I-R-S-T. The R is not at all distinct, and likely as a result of the writing instrument, neither is the S. Again, though, in the context of a sentence, you may be able to figure this out and use the author's penmanship to decipher additional words. Well into the 19th century, a capital I and J were interchangeable. This was our example of the alphabet shown earlier. Notice that the I and J are the same entries. Here are some examples of I and J in names. These are 2 versions of Isaac, 2 versions of Jeremiah, followed by Joshua and Joseph. Using what you've learned so far, study these and see if you can decipher them. The first name is Rufus Morse. The second is Eliza. And finally, Elizabeth. Here's another list of names. They are Alexander Sutherland, Thomas Johnston, George Ross, and Thomas Smith. To that end, since many of us are trying to search for names within these historical documents, it's often easier if you search colonial era men's names that would be considered unusual today, that might help you in your deciphering of some of these documents. Using what you've learned so far, try and read this paragraph. It reads, "We have confidence in your recommendation of Mr. James Geoghegan, and therefore shall be obliged to him to supply the company with provisions until the contractor, to whose notice we will recommend him, can do it." This sample has a bit of everything: D's that loop over their words, capital words in mid-sentence, a very interesting P, and E's that look like our modern-day O. If you are really struggling to decipher the handwriting of a document, my last bit of advice is to try writing the document for yourself. Create a copy of the record you're looking at and lay some tracing paper over it. Slowly trace each letter of each word on your own. You might make discoveries by going through the motions yourself and feel the differences in the letters. Good luck and happy hunting!